I think the base game of Elden Ring is a masterpiece. Within the action RPG genre, it represents some of the very best that you'll find. A first playthrough of the game is such a magical experience, and I still find myself reminiscing about my own. For me, it's a game that goes beyond a simple recommendation, and instead I think everyone just needs to try it even if they think it might not be for them. It's really just that special. And yet, Shadow of the Erdtree, this new DLC, surpasses the base game. FromSoft has exceeded my expectations, and as a whole, this DLC might be my favorite thing FromSoft has ever created. I know that's insane praise, and I'm sure my feelings will soften over time as I'm still in the honeymoon phase, but I sincerely feel that right now. My first playthrough of the DLC took nearly 40 hours, and I was enthralled for every minute of it. If you clicked on this video just to hear me say game good, there you go. Game good. Game very, very good. But why game good? And how game good? These are the questions I still want to try to answer. As a brief overview though, before we get into it, the world design is phenomenal. There's a staggering amount of new combat options. The bosses are fantastic spectacles that are fun to learn. The legacy dungeons kick ass. There is so much great side content, and the new upgrade system helps recapture the progression of the base game. All of this is made even more engaging by the DLC being very challenging in the best possible way. Anyway, let's talk about it. In a recent interview, Miyazaki discussed the size of the map in the DLC. He said that he wanted players to experience that same sense of wonder and discovery found in the base game. And to achieve that, he knew the world would need to be big. And my god, FromSoft delivered. This map is massive, and I absolutely felt that same sense of wonder and discovery. Every time I'd reach a new region, I'd be hit with a wave of awe at the sheer scale and beauty of what I was looking at. And then immediately after, I'd be filled with excitement at the prospect of getting to explore it. However big you think this DLC is, it's probably bigger. Now, that alone is impressive, but that's not the part that really got me about the map. No, it's the design of the world itself. For starters, it's so vertical. I already thought the base game did a lot of interesting things with verticality, but in comparison to the DLC, it looks simple. Standing at the edge of a cliff, you can look down and see an entire region below. But then on that same cliff, you can look up and see an entirely different region above you. This sort of verticality is found all over the map. It's really cool, and it creates this layering effect that I haven't seen before in an open world game, at least not to this magnitude. Additionally, and this is my favorite part, with this verticality comes the game constantly teasing you with locations you can see, but not obviously reach. This is something the base game occasionally did, but not nearly as much here. And again, it's constant. There are so many little moments designed to tantalize the player with an area or region just out of reach, and simply traversing the world and reaching the vast majority of its regions becomes a mystery you slowly unfold. I guarantee that loads of people will miss out on sizable chunks of the DLC because they just didn't find them. And it's so cool that FromSoft does shit like this. They'll hide entire regions of the map behind some nowhere cave or a random fake wall. It's fantastic and the type of thing you're not going to see other AAA developers do. Big areas that were well hidden existed in the base game too, with stuff like Volcano Manor or the Erdtree being easily missable. But it's cranked up to an outrageous degree here, such that the majority of the game's regions and bosses are hidden in one way or another. I love it. Remember the first time you made it to Seofor River? You step onto an elevator, assuming it'll be a little side thing, and suddenly you're met with a breathtaking sight, and it slowly dawns on you just how big this area is. And then you realize, wait, this is a side area? I could have missed this? Just pure wonder and excitement. Playing through this DLC is like getting the chance to re-experience that moment again and again. But yeah, the world design is what really elevates this DLC for me to all-timer status, and it's something that's easier to feel for yourself than describe in a YouTube video. While we're still talking about the map, this world is jaw-droppingly gorgeous. I lack the words to express how cool this shit is. When exploring the overworld, I felt like I could just stop moving at any time, and a screenshot of that moment would make for a beautiful painting. The base game has many moments like this too, of course, but man, they take it to another level here. This DLC has some of the best art direction I've ever seen in a video game, and it's crazy how FromSoft keeps surpassing themselves. It might seem silly to harp on, but it really can't be overstated just how much the world itself pulls you in to help create this one-of-a-kind experience. Now, exploring a pretty world is nice and all, but let's get to the real meat of the game, the combat. So I mentioned in my last video that there are 8 new weapon types, and I first just want to say how amazing they all are to use. I made an effort to thoroughly try them all out, and I'm happy to report that they all kick ass, so go nuts. My favorites were the backhand blades, great katanas, perfume bottles, and light greatswords. These new weapons are already enough on their own to be great, but what really surprised me was all the variety that extended beyond this, and in hindsight, I feel like I undersold the extent of new combat options on offer here in my last video. We now have about 100 new weapons, and in many cases, even when these weapons are added to existing weapon types, they feel fresh as hell with new abilities. In some cases, it's a special skill, like a flail that lets you buff it with fire, and then that fire ignites into an explosion on a strong attack. In other cases, it's new moves built into the base movesets, like multiple weapons that now have throwing attacks, where you can input strong attack to throw the weapon at 0 FP cost. These ones wound up being my favorite type of new attack, and I'm kind of astounded at how strong this playstyle can be. And then of course, there's a bunch of new sorceries and incantations to throw into the mix. So yeah, there are a stupid amount of really fun and unique weapons, and if there's one suggestion I could give you, is to just try a bunch of them out. If it seems cool, upgrade it and go for it. The DLC isn't shy about dumping upgrade materials on you. I have a friend who also got early access to the DLC, and after talking with him, it sounds like he's been playing through it almost entirely with just the greatsword. Like, I get it, that's totally valid. I'm sure some of you think he's base for doing that, but also, it pained me to think about how much he was missing out on with all the cool new stuff. But hey, that's the great part about this game. You have a lot of interesting options, and it's up to you what you want to take advantage of. Speaking of interesting options, a few months ago I played through a mod called Elden Ring Reforged, and as part of that mod, there was a system that allowed for perfect blocks. Think Sekiro or Lies of P. But basically, timing your block just as an attack landed would negate the stamina loss and give a slight damage boost. Well, guess what? This has essentially been added as a new mechanic in the DLC. It's sadly not always enabled like the mod, but it comes in the form of a new early game crystal tier for your Flask of Wondrous Physic, and its duration is 3 minutes, which is usually enough time to last for an entire boss fight. While using it, perfectly timed blocks negate almost all stamina loss while also boosting your next guard counter, and I can't stress enough how well this fits into the game as a combat option. You can block with a shield, or if you're feeling brave, block with a weapon. It adds a whole new dimension to boss fights, and it makes defensive playstyles infinitely more engaging and rewarding. I had so much fun relying on this for multiple bosses, and I don't think I ever unequipped it after I got it. Just trust me on this one, try it out and you'll see why I'm raving about it. And that brings us to the bosses. Fuck man, they're so good. I don't want to show too much here or go into detail for spoiler reasons, but I really enjoyed just about every fight, and I think a few of these are some of the best bosses FromSoft has created. They're such spectacles from start to finish, and there were even a few times where I literally found myself yelling in excitement at what I was seeing on my screen. And that's just the visual side of things. The fights themselves are fantastic and really fun to learn, with them feeling brutal but ultimately fair. There are some all-timers here. Like, if you ask me what my favorite bosses in the game are now, most of them would be from the DLC, no question. In terms of main bosses, most of them are quite challenging and a step above the base game with tricky movesets designed to punish experienced players. Granted, I go out of my way to avoid NPC summons and spirit ashes, but still, even if you use those tools, as I imagine most people will, you'll still be in for a rough time compared to the base game. Also, there's just a lot here. The DLC has nearly as many big event main bosses as the base game. It's awesome. On the topic of difficulty, I really like the level of challenge found in the DLC. In the base game, for someone like me who's experienced and knowledgeable with how FromSoft games go, while I found the game challenging, I just as often wished it was a bit harder. It was mainly just the late game that really pushed me. Part of that is because it's a little too easy to be over-leveled or over-geared if you're taking advantage of the open world structure of the game and doing everything. On one hand, I love the freedom this gives players, and in terms of accessibility, this makes Elden Ring a great introduction for newcomers. It's a big reason I recommend it to basically everyone, and think it's a great place to start if you're getting into the genre. On the other hand, it does have the consequence of being less engaging for people around my skill level. Anyway, all of this is a long way of saying that the DLC is notably harder than the base game, and as a result, extra fun for me. And like, it should be hard. It's post-game content, so it can escalate from the later parts of the base game rather than starting from zero. The prospect of dying a couple dozen times to a boss as I slowly learn its moveset is exciting and one of my favorite parts of these types of games. While the difficulty is never the point, it's still an important component as it's the glue that holds all of the systems together and gives players that sense of triumph from overcoming a tough challenge. Now, I recognize not everyone feels this way about the difficulty, and there are many different skill levels out there, and that's completely fine. You'll still be okay, because connected to this difficulty is the new progression system. You can now find items called Erdtree fragments across the world, and these allow you to upgrade the Erdtree blessing level of your character. Each level provides a 5% boost to your attack power, and a similar boost to all of your defenses, but only when you're in the DLC area. At the time I made my last video, I didn't realize just how big of a difference these things would make, and it didn't hit me until bosses were 1 or 2-shotting me due to my blessing level. Hell, even normal enemies would destroy me sometimes. To help paint a picture, your armor might provide a 20% reduction to physical damage in the base game, but after bumping up your blessing to level 10, you'll suddenly be receiving something like over 50% damage reduction instead. Trust me, you'll need this. And that blessing level can be boosted all the way to level 20. This allows FromSoft to design the world of the DLC in a similar way to the base game, with lots of what I like to call soft barriers. Think fighting Margit, or entering Caelid when you're low level. Both of these are accessible from the start, but their difficulty is meant to encourage you to get stronger elsewhere. Since the damage boost and damage reduction from the Erdtree blessings are so significant, the DLC maintains this structure, and you get the chance to re-experience the rush of encountering something you're under-leveled for, and the subsequent joy that comes from exploring the world to get stronger in meaningful ways. Oh yeah, also, there's a similar upgrade material and blessing that exists for your spirit summons in Torrent, so that too feeds into this new progression loop. So even though I've raved about how I love the difficulty, don't let that scare you off, because A, you can use spirit summons, and B, you can always come back later after raising your blessing levels. In fact, I believe FromSoft very much intended for you to get absolutely destroyed the first time you find some of these guys as a means of encouraging you to explore more, like encountering the Tree Sentinel at level 1 in the base game. They've recaptured that experience multiple times in the DLC. Moving on, let's talk a bit about the Legacy Dungeons. Once again, FromSoft has crushed it. They can be just as breathtaking as the open world, and I was reminded how playing these games is a capital E experience that goes beyond just the combat. There's this rhythm to enemy encounters, exploration, and secret finding wrapped within tight level design that FromSoft has down to a science at this point, and it's the type of thing that's difficult to convey why it works as well as it does. One of the Legacy Dungeons is especially big and layered, and it's just a blast to experience. It's a great time to be a FromSoft fan. Connected to this discussion, let's talk a bit about the discrete side areas like caves, catacombs, jails, or fire dungeons. They're all great as well. That same sort of rhythm is maintained here, and they're put together so thoughtfully. Like everything else, these often rise beyond the heights of the base game. And I'm not kidding when I say that these side areas are some of the best parts of the DLC. These areas are often pretty big too. Like, it wasn't uncommon for me to enter one and have it take me a solid 20 to 30 minutes. And to cap these areas off, we naturally often have side bosses. While obviously not on the challenge level of the main bosses, I appreciate how many of them would still have some element of the fight designed to trip you up and catch you off guard. Again, thinking back to the base game, I felt like I beat a lot of these on my first try, but here that didn't happen nearly as often. And I attribute that to their design more than just the raw number balancing involved. And then of course, the real magic that makes everything work is all the little moments in between. Those moments of mystery and excitement, whether it comes from discovering a new area, finding a new item, seeing a new enemy, or following an NPC questline. There's nothing quite like it. To finish up, I want to amend a few things I mentioned in my last video about the 3-hour preview event. I said my only real nitpick was being disappointed by a few enemies and bosses from the base game being reused in the DLC. I also said how seeing the full context of the DLC could change my opinion on this. Well, I've now seen the full context, and I'm happy to say I don't actually have an issue with it. I think this is for a few reasons. First, FromSoft is typically quite deliberate with where they reuse things. Like, sure, you'll see enemies or the occasional boss from the base game repeated, but it's mostly done in a way that makes it feel fresh still by providing it a new context. A great example would be these living jar enemies found in the jail caves. They were a base game enemy, but it's really fun seeing them in this new and relevant setting, and in terms of level design, they're still utilized in a very thoughtful way. Second, in the cases of bosses being reused, even though it's rare, they're still often remixed in a way that turns it into something distinct. Like here, there's a Ghost Flame Dragon, a repeat boss that's mostly a reskin from a base game dragon, but this time it's mid-battle against a whole army of soldiers, and getting to jump into the fray as both parties fight back leads to a very memorable and fun encounter. Third, sometimes enemies just get new moves. Like yeah, these dudes on screen are from the base game, but a few of them do crazy stuff now. And again, it leads to something new and memorable. Fourth, this is ultimately Elden Ring DLC, not a new game. Frankly, it would feel weird to not see that connective tissue of base game enemies and bosses in the DLC, because this still takes place in the same world. It adds cohesion to the experience, and in many cases, new context to the world building and lore. Lastly, and most importantly, there's just a lot of brand new enemies and bosses. The vast majority is new. Therefore, the old stuff blends in and adds a texture to everything that's new, rather than overshadowing it. So yeah, it all works for me. I'm sure I'll see some level of pushback on this in the weeks to come on a case-by-case basis when it comes to reuse assets, but as a whole, it's tastefully and deliberately done. Next, don't worry about entering this DLC over-leveled. I recommended level 120 to 150 in the last video, but I lean much more toward 150 and up now. This is very much post-game content, so whatever level you are after doing everything in the base game, that's a good spot to be. Plus, with the way Erdtree blessings work, they'll eventually supersede any diminishing returns you'll get from more character levels. Lastly, I mentioned in the previous video how it seemed like the DLC would be more linear than the base game, with you needing to kill a certain boss to reach another zone. Having played the full game, that assumption was incorrect, and the DLC is wildly open to the point of you having the freedom to go to a bunch of different areas even from the start. And that's about it. There's more I want to say and gush about, and maybe even a couple nitpicks like any game would have, but to go further would require specifics and risk spoiling too much. So I'm gonna leave it here for now. With Elden Ring, you only get one first playthrough. It's something truly special and magical. Playing through Shadow of the Erdtree gave me that first playthrough feeling all over again, and like the base game, I'm going to be thinking about it for a very long time. If you decide to play it, I hope you connect with it as much as I did. Thanks for watching.